I'm going to talk about a book which is the first in a loose series that I want to do kind of off and on classic works of Marxist literary theory. And it's Pierre Macherey's A Theory of Literary Production. This was first written in French in 1966, but wasn't translated into English until the late 70s. It had a major influence, particularly in England, maybe not so much in the US, particularly on Terry Eagleton, one of the major Marxist literary critics writing in English. And it's very much from the Althusserian school of Marxist theory. So, to give a very rough sketch of Louis Althusser's thinking, Althusser was what's become known as a structural Marxist. He was asking about how the broad structure of society determines the beliefs and actions of those within it, but in a more complicated way than had held previously. So the familiar economic base, determining the cultural superstructure that Marxist theory had always held to, Althusser sort of complicated by saying that different areas of society, from the art world to the state, to education to religion, each had a sort of semi-autonomy. It wasn't quite as simple as the economic base ruthlessly determining everything in this other level, but these different spheres could react against each other, even if in the last instance they were determined by the mode of production, the capitalist mode of production. So he gave theorists some new ideas to play with, so perhaps some more flexibility. He was also well known for writing against humanism, and connected to that his distinction between science and ideology. Now, by ideology he didn't mean a sort of illusion that some people have but others don't. He was clear that everyone needs an ideology to live by, but he held that science, Marxist science, would sort of see things for how they really are, apart from these ideologies, which would be necessary for further Marxist action. But ultimately, even a communist society would require an ideology to order everyone and provide their place within this society. And along with this goes with a sort of questioning of the concept of the self, the subject, which became a pretty key part of French theory in those years. He got this from the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, even if he misinterpreted him in certain ways. But he was particularly concerned to work against any idea of the humanist concept of the individual who has shaped himself, who makes himself. I think he said something that he himself was an Althusser effect of the structure of capitalist society. So Macherey, who was part of Althusser's circle, who participated in Althusser's seminars that resulted in the famous book Reading Capital. Macherey wanted to apply some of these ideas to literary theory and literary criticism, which wasn't his main focus. He was mainly interested in philosophical questions more broadly. But this book, I think, has some pretty fascinating ideas that are worth picking up on. It's, in its own way, it's quite accessible. So the theoretical part is only about 100 pages long. The rest of the book, the next 220, are readings of Jules Verne, Balzac, Borges, Robinson Crusoe. But the theoretical part is quite short chapters, which are certainly crunchy enough to reward reading, but short enough to be accessible. And each chapter often has a very dialectic title: inner and outer, questions and answers, rule and law, front and back, that kind of thing. Now, what Macherey tries to bring out, at least at the beginning, is that what literary criticism often does is it sort of constructs a new object. It sort of pretends it's going to talk about what the meaning of a literary text is, as if it can kind of extract it from the husk of the text, but in fact ends up sort of retelling the work in other words, which kind of becomes a new object, rather than the object of literature itself. And Macherey wants to do something quite different. He wants to question that the literary work is a sort of self-sufficient object that the genius of a creator, creative genius, has somehow produced. He wants to see the literary work as more of a production, as in the title of the book. He wants to ask, well, what materials were around that the author used to create this work, to produce this work? What determinants determined what the work would be like? What ideologies went into its making? And perhaps one of the things the book's most well known for is that he doesn't think that any literary work necessarily has one coherent ideology. The ideology might be conflicted, in fact, probably usually is conflicted. It has tensions within it, has contradictions within it that may be entirely necessary to make the ideology as a whole work. I think, for example, of a Christian Zionist newspaper I saw recently that has an article about Lord Nelson and described him as a wonderful Christian, apart from the way that he treated his wife. Now, if you look into that, you find that he abandoned his wife and lived with another woman. So something completely against the paper's general idea of what a wonderful Christian would be. And yet somehow, because they wish to affirm a kind of nostalgic, heroic memory for their overall ideology, they have to maintain this contradiction. So Macherey is interested in that idea, that can be conflicting ideologies within the work. Most famously, though, he's probably most well known for talking about the silences of a text. So he's saying that actually what the work is about isn't necessarily in the literal words themselves, but it's about what they don't say, what they assume, what they omit. And that is itself very telling. Now, to go back to my example from that article, the very words chosen, he was a wonderful Christian, even though he treated his wife terribly. In fact, it didn't even say terribly. It said, despite the way he treated his wife. So just from that, we might think, well, maybe he was a bit cold with her, or, wasn't always the nicest to her, didn't quite spend enough time. There's a pregnant silence about what exactly he did do or not. But that itself is very telling as to what will be admitted or not in fashioning this ideology. So overall, Macherey stresses that he's not out to interpret texts. He's not out to discover this meaning, whatever meaning is, that's somehow hidden in them. He's out to explain texts. How are they assembled? What are the determinants that came together to produce them? And this, of course, will sound very mechanistic and demystifying compared to how literature might usually be spoken of as a work of creative genius, a source of beauty or eternal values and so on. And it would be interesting to ask why that might feel threatening to some. We might ask, does Macherey miss something of the subjective nature of literature, or the power that it has on the reader? Does he not explore that? And when I talk about Adorno's aesthetic theory, that might come into things more there. But I think this text gives some interesting tools and interesting challenges to conventional ways of thinking about literature and how to go about criticising it.